Hey guys, so in this video I wanted to discuss a critique of David Lade's DUP program, since I get a lot of questions about the program, and I think it would be something that would just be good to go over and just kind of give you a little bit of a background on, who I think the program's good for, what I would potentially change about it, what I like that the program does, good things about it. Just for a little bit of a background about me, I have my major in exercise science from Brigham Young University. I am an elite powerlifter in the USPA. I basically spend all my time kind of learning about this stuff, reviewing a lot of the literature on the science of periodization, exercise, strength training, nutrition, all that good stuff. Basically, I am a exercise nerd. So yeah, just a little bit about me, just as like a background, like why you maybe want to listen to me. But anyways, just a little bit of a background. For those of you who don't know who David Lade is, which let's be frank, if you click on this video, you know who David Lade is. He is a gym track athlete. He is one of the most influential people in the entire fitness industry. He inspired me to work out, a lot of other kids too. So David's made a large impact on the fitness industry as a whole. And originally, when he was starting out his training, he shared his programs for absolutely free. And you can kind of see them if you go back in time, look up David Lade's programs, go onto his videos. He shows his programming that he ran for a while, his first two programs. And first off, he ran a basic novice linear progression, 5x5, Jason Baja, which is great because in the novice stage of training, what's important to focus on is developing technical proficiency, maxing out neurological adaptations in the beginning with high frequency exposure to the competition movements, so squat, bench, and deadlift. David's always been very, very big on muscle and hypertrophy as a baseline of progression, with also having strength progressive overload as on the big three, in particular squat, bench, and deadlift, to drive progress, which is great. And I think that that's an amazing message to just spread to who is beginning weight training. In order to get bigger and more muscular, you need to be training with enough volume to be able to trigger an adaptation, progressive overload, for that to actually occur. And something that people don't understand about progressive overload is that you need enough volume, enough of a stimulus in order for it to occur, so that you can actually recover and then have an adaptation take place. And so having a 3x5 or a 5x5 novice linear progression, milking it out for as long as possible, makes a lot of sense for that beginning stage. So David started out basically training properly. And then for, I believe, the next 3 or 4 years of training, this was prior to his DUP, he ran a basic linear periodized program, which basically the concept of linear periodization is where your volume is going to start high and intensity is going to start low, and then as the mesocycle increases, as you will progress over time with the training program, the training block, you will lower the reps and then increase intensity, so the weight used on the barbell, to basically have a strength test at the very, very end, a 1 rep max, and then you will restart the progression again, going from high to low. And the overall consensus in the literature is that basically you want to run a novice linear progression. It's like a 5x5 with frequent exposure to intensities, basically no periodization, right? So we're just doing like the same workout over and over and over again. There's nothing that is changing over time. And that's what you should run as a beginner, because you want to, again, have the neurological proficiency, net technical proficiency, have lots of practice with the competition lifts, be able to make the most out of your new gains at the beginning stage. Once that stops working, then you want to move into a linear periodized program as you're transitioning from the beginner to the early intermediate stage, and then milk that out for as long as possible. Now, David made some pretty good progress during this time running these basic programs. If you're familiar with it, it would basically be starting off the training cycle with a heavy single, and then having sets of 8 or 10 or whatever, and then progressing down to like 4s, to 6s, 4s, 2s, something like that across the time, deloading at the end, and then having, again, restarting the progression over and over and over again. So it's a lot of high volume competition specificity. I believe it was a legs push pull, so David would usually run. And obviously that worked for a little bit, but the thing is, David stalled out for a pretty long time using this. For, if you do follow his progress, he didn't really make much strength progress, much muscle progress, much size progress beyond a certain point. And that's just because linear progression only works super well for, you know, a certain amount of time. There's going to be some adaptive resistance that will take place. The repeated bout effect will also, you know, that's basically the repeated bout effect. As we do more of the same thing over time, our body becomes more efficient at adapting to it and handling that stimulus and that stress in a predictable and repeated manner. So in other words, one of the biggest reasons why David just stopped kind of making as much progress and kind of had this big stall in his strength, and, you know, even had some periods of regression when he wasn't taking his training that seriously, was because he wasn't periodizing his training intelligently enough for him to be able to still make progress. Because it will only, something like a linear progression, like every single program is going to have an aspect of linearity to it, because you're basically going to be progressing towards a specific goal, and your training is going to have to change over time in order to get to that point. And because David's main goals were to get stronger on the big three while having muscular hypertrophy as a side effect of that, since you know, we have evidence that muscle hypertrophy occurs across every single rep range. Higher volumes, just, you know, higher rep ranges seem to be a little more efficient from a stimulus to fatigue ratio standpoint. Basically, over time, you know, your body becomes a little bit more adapted to that. It doesn't work as well, and so that's why he kind of stalled out for a while. And there was one point in time when David started running this daily undulating periodization, which is kind of where this program came from. And DUP is basically the concept where you retrain in multiple rep ranges and intensities across a training week on your different lifts. So maybe instead of like with a you know, a linear periodized program, you're just doing 8s 1 week, and that's the only type of rep range that you work across. Maybe you'll have a, you know, a hypertrophy day where you're working with sets of you know, 8 to 12. Maybe you're doing a more of a strength day where you're doing, you know, higher intensity strength work, and then you have one power day, which is also going to be, you know, lower reps, but, you know, at a lower intensity, just so you can get a little bit more volume. You can accumulate it, still practice that skill, and accumulate a little bit more volume specifically on the lifts that you're trying to improve. There is good evidence that this is a great way for intermediates to progress, because they need more novelty of stimulus. As well, adaptations will take more time, so you can't progress the same way on the same exercises across the training week. And having some more of this, you know, up and down pattern with how you're training your lifts with intensity ranges of volumes, etc., you're going to be able to have a little bit better learning too of the movements, and be able to, you know, build muscle and strength a little bit more efficiently. So that's basically what David's program is built upon. And if you look at David's little sales pitch on his stage, I'll blue up on the screen right now. You know, it says daily undulating periodization has been clinically demonstrated to yield the highest strength returns over any method of periodization. Progressive tension overload is the central driver of muscle growth. The stronger we get, the more rapidly we can increase vertical volume and achieve progressive tension overload. So this is a, you know, obviously, you know, I'm down with all that. I think that all makes a lot of good sense. You know, it has been shown to be more beneficial for intermediates and whatnot. However, lots of David's audience is not an intermediate lifter. I think that lots of times people like to think that they are an intermediate lifter or more advanced than they are, because it just sounds cooler to them. But most people, in order to reach an intermediate stage, you should go through these stages of having a novice progression, then a linear progression, and then once that doesn't work anymore and you need some more variation, that's when DUP comes in. That's when you can kind of basically say, hey, yeah, I am probably an intermediate. I am in that intermediate stage where gains are a little bit slower. I have to work a little bit harder. My periodization has to become a little bit more nuanced. My training microcycle will have to have more variation and exercises in terms of intensity, workload, etc. And then overload in those ranges have a little more novelty, and don't take advantage of the repeated bout effect by, you know, making it less repeatable. So your body is a little bit like, like muscle confusion kind of has some like merit to it. you can't use the same thing forever and still progress the exact same way. It's just not how your body works. Like, that's why changing things up makes sense. And the great thing about DUP is that it does take that principle already into its periodization model. So that's a little bit of the background of DUP and whatnot. So yeah, I'm going to dive a little bit more into the program in the next clip and show you guys like what exactly I would change about it, and using the scientific principles of strength training from Chad Wesley Smith and Dr. Mike Israetel's scientific principles of strength training to provide the background of the basis of this video, just so that you guys can understand like where I'm coming from, and then tell you what I think this program does well, what I would change about it, and all that good stuff. So, alright, so in this half of the video, I'm going to be going over each one of these scientific principles of strength training. First off, by defining what they mean, what I believe that David's program does well in its application, and what he does not do well in its application to it, and elaborate a little bit on what I would change and why. So first off, the most important principle of any sort of program is specificity. And specificity basically creates the framework by which every other training decision is made. You can think of it as, if you want to get better at sprinting, your training program should be developed to develop those underlying systems of sprinting. In the case of David's program, if he wants to mainly get stronger, this is mainly a strength-focused program, driving the kind of revolve around pushing your strength up on the squat, bench, and deadlift. You're going to want to train those underlying systems that are going to contribute to strength. So frequent exposure to heavy loads, plenty of volume work to develop muscle hypertrophy and enhance work capacity, stuff like that. And David's program does a very, very good job of having frequent heavy exposures that are going to drive those neural adaptations. They're going to certainly induce a strength response throughout your training with relatively high relative intensity. So RPE is rate of perceived exertions of 8 to 9 or more, meaning that you're close proximities to failure throughout it, which is important for developing peak strength qualities. He does that through heavy top sets and heavy down sets, with lower, basically with the top set being more of a higher absolute intensity, and then the down sets being a lower absolute intensity, but still keeping relative intensity between the RPE 8 to 9 range. So he does a very, very good job of that. So you certainly are going to get plenty of a strength signal to your body to adapt and get stronger. Another thing that it does well is he has plenty of hypertrophy work, which is going to develop muscular hypertrophy. Obviously, there's lots of volume with the accessories, and you're going to certainly be able to have enough volume to be able to build muscle and become a little bit more aesthetically pleasing, and also have most of the exercises that he chooses for the accessories have very, very good transference to the key lift, or like the lift that they're training on that day. So for example, some exercises are going to have a very good transference. So in the case of the squat, like if you're training an accessory movement besides the squat, like a pause squat has a lot of good transference. Leg press has decent transference because you're going to be able to train those target movers, but also because it's a press of some sort. And whereas an exercise with low transference would be like a leg extension, since it's not a press at all. It's basically an entirely different movement pattern, that type of stuff. So basically, like, the closer the movement pattern is to the actual movement pattern that you're trying to get better at, the more degree of transference it's going to have. So it doesn't really do a very, very good job of that on the flip side, though. With some of its exercise selection. So for example, having a push press doesn't really make sense for driving a bench press strength. It's in a completely different plane of motion. It's not exactly something I don't think that I've seen any elite powerlifter in the IPF or the USPA or IPL do. Like, it doesn't really make sense to me. And I would rather put a bench variation on that secondary day, or just a second bench exposure, a different rep range to respect the non-linearity of a DUP style program. Second, there's some loading ranges I don't believe make much sense. On deadlift, he does keep within. So basically, if we're talking about powerlifting and what ranges make sense to train the main movements on the squat, bench, and deadlift, between 1 to 10 reps is probably going to be your best bet. As you get above 10 reps, you're going to start to be straying too far away from fiber-specific hypertrophy. There's different changes in potentiation angles of when you do train different rep ranges. Strength is specific, and you want to train close to your 1 rep max. There's a reason why bodybuilders are very, very, very good at training in higher rep ranges, and can do much more volume on them than powerlifters can. But if we compare a 1 rep max of a 230-pound bodybuilder to a 230-pound powerlifter, the powerlifter is probably going to be better at the 1 rep max because strength is specific. So if you're training too much above an RPE to 10 reps, you're going to just stray too far away from that. And so in some of the undulation pattern that he uses on squat, bench, and deadlift, it's basically going to be a 4-8-12. On the deadlift, it is 6-4-2. On the volume work, it doesn't really make sense. Like something I would do instead of that would just do exactly what David does on the the deadlift. I don't think it's something that's too bad. I personally don't see a big need to train deadlift above our sets of 6 personally. So I would rather do a 6-4-2 undulation pattern on deadlift. For a squat, bench, and deadlift, a 7-5-3 would make more sense, just because typically squat, bench, and deadlift do need a little bit more volume in order to drive adaptations. There's also an eccentric component, so it's a little bit more skill. Whereas deadlift, you're just dropping it, so you need to have a little bit more practice with that skill. And more reps is going to help you out with that. As well, deadlifts tend to be a little bit more fatiguing, and having slightly lower reps does help with the fatigue management side of things in terms of volume that you actually can accumulate realistically. So that's what I would change about his program, what he did well and what he didn't do well with specificity. Now, the second principle is going to be overload. And overload is basically going to be, simply put, training has to be hard enough in order for an adaptation to occur. And overload can be, there's 2 parts to overload. It can be either within the maximal threshold of the adaptive system, or on average greater than the historical stimuli. So overload is a range. We can refer to it as a spectrum, and this is one of the reasons why RPE training does work well. On some days you're gonna have undulations in performance based off of your recoverability and whatnot. It's just because stress is stress. Maybe you didn't sleep as well, maybe you're more stressed, whatever. An RPE 8 isn't always going to be an RPE 8 at the exact same level. Maybe one day on your best day when you're peaked at your competition, your single is going to be a certain very, very high load, whereas maybe during normal training, or you had a bad day, your same 1 rep max will be suppressed due to the nature of fatigue. But the thing about RPE training is that as long as you're within a certain threshold in terms of certain relative intensity, your body only knows that relative intensity from a actual adaptation standpoint. However, having this is where the second part of this does come in. It needs to be on average greater than the historical stimulus. Like if we're just saying, oh well, I'm training with RPE, but if you're not really getting better over time, there's not an upward trend, you're not really overloading, if that makes sense. Something needs to change, whether that's volume, intensity, whatever you are doing with your program needs to obviously change. So David's program does a good job of overload in terms of its program during the spreadsheet in terms of a 3-week kind of wave. It's over nine weeks where you add about either 5 to 10 pounds over the 3-week wave. And you have plenty of heavy training with top set work and down set work to develop all those previous factors I mentioned in my specificity. So it does a good job with that. You're always training heavy. You're always striving to add weights to the bar in some way, shape, or form. And David always stresses that. And if you follow David, if you buy into his stuff, if you follow his content, he's always talking about progressive overload. So, however, it has a very poor long-term planning of overload. And what I mean by that is that if you're constantly, so from the beginning, you're starting out with a very, very high relative intensity. And if we're going to conceptualize overload, there needs to be long-term planning with it. So you need to plan for long-term fitness adaptations being bigger and being stronger. In the case of a powerlifter, somebody who wants to get more muscular and more strength. if you're constantly starting out at super high relative intensities, it's going to be harder for your body to recover and adapt and elicit an adaptive response. You're gonna have less predictability of performance. Some weeks you might not be able to hit the prescribed lows because it's a template program. You kind of autofill it. David doesn't have anything like on the side saying, oh, this is what this is what your the RPE should be for this week. But I use an RPE percentage chart that's like developed by Mike Teixeira and plenty of other powerlifting coaches to kind of just say, oh, like, where is this starting and where is this ending? You start out at like RPE like 8.59ish, and you just progress from there by adding like 5 to 10 pounds. And in theory, that's fine, but say that you are a ranked novice and your ability to adapt is not that fast, or whatnot. Maybe you get crushed. There are issues with injury risk of always training that heavy all the time. And usually progress kind of has like a asymptotic relationship where it's going to kind of, or an exponential curve. It's going to kind of start off slowly and then kind of ramp up as you realize those adaptations. Because in the beginning of a training cycle, how it kind of goes is fatigue is going to kind of, fatigue will accumulate linearly, whereas these adaptations kind of slowly build up and build up. Fatigue will kind of outpace that a lot of the time, and then later on, or it just is going on along, can go at the same rate as fatigue. Eventually, you're gonna have a pace where it's going to take off once those adaptations are kind of realized, and then you'll be able to push a little harder. So, what I would do instead of that is maybe start off at an RPE 6 or 7. And then progress from week 1 like RPE 6 to 7, week 2 RPE 7 to 8, and then like the third wave, like go to so the first three week wave RPE 6 to 7, the second 3 week wave you do RPE 7 to 8, and then the last 3 week wave you do RPE 8 to 9. That's going to help have more predictability of performance. You're going to be able to manage fatigue better, and by managing fatigue better, you're going to be able to then have a better overload and predictability of performance. Also, he doesn't do a very good job of having any sort of undulation in the weekly training split. There's no clear primary or secondary day of importance, and I like, and this is something that's very common in powerlifting programming and just training for strength in general. You want to have days where you're going to be strongest, and coaches know that, and you know this from I'm going to talk about this later, but the principle of SRA, if you have a big stimulus, a big overloading stimulus, it takes time to recover and adapt to that. And so we can't expect always to be at peak strength on every single training week out. Once you're beyond that ranked novice stage, you're going to have to program for that into account, knowing that with each sort of overload, you're going to have fatigue accumulated, and you're going to have to manage that. And so maybe having a secondary day where you have, maybe that primary day, for example, I was saying RPE 6 to 7, week 1, maybe that primary day we have a 7 RPE average intensity, and that secondary day we have a 6 RPE average intensity. That's something that could be, very, very beneficial for ensuring that we are creating overload, because what mostly matters is that primary day in terms of overload, and having this constant, overload at one, static intensity across the training week. No day is clear. I think that he tries to get around this with having like, one day where it's like, for example, in week 1 you do a 5 rep max on the squat and then 4 by 12 on the first squat day, and then you do a 3 rep max and then a 4 by 8. But it still is within that same heavy loading range. Like there's no undulation in relative intensity at all, and that's just going to create a flaw in the ability to overload. There's no primary day of importance, right? So that's something that I would change. So the third principle is going to be fatigue management, and this basically is going to state that hard training, which is going to induce an overload, is necessary for you to get better, for you to get bigger and stronger. But it's also going to bring fatigue that must be managed. And if you have too much fatigue accumulated, you're going to have a performance decline, and you're not going to be able to overload. And I did kind of address this. What's one good thing that he does? Well, he incorporates daily underlying periodization across the microcycle, across the training macrocycle, and having those different variations in intensities in terms of absolute intensities with the rep ranges is, that's going to help manage your fatigue to some extent. However, because there's no undulation in relative intensity, you're constantly pushing hard no matter what the rep range is. So that's a very, very, very poor way of organizing the training week. Additionally, especially if you're trying to train that hard all the time, having 6 days a week of training with only one rest day typically is not the best for most powerlifters. Most powerlifters that are really big and strong don't train 6 days per week. Most of them that I have seen, I've talked to, train anywhere between 4 to 5 days per week, and that's because of there's different time courses of healing of the nervous system, of the muscular systems. Nervous system is going to take a longer time to heal, recover. There's systemic fatigue that does accumulate. It's going to, like, it's not just local. It's not just like you do a squat day and it only affects your squat. There's going to be fatigue that will, leak into your bench press and all of that stuff. So not very good fatigue management. As well, I don't see any sort of deloads programmed into the program proactively. Deloads are really, really important to make sure that you are actually making long-term adaptations. Basically, deloading is going to be a reduction in volume and intensity at some point in the training period, because there will be a point where fatigue will outpace your fitness, your ability to adapt and get bigger and stronger. And unless you take care of that, like, there's just the saying that I use with my clients is deload, or else your body will deload for you. And that's going to be in the case of a performance reduction, some sort of injury, and we don't want that. We want to be able to plan for that and have, periods of fatigue reduction where we can realize these adaptations that we've taken place during the training cycle, and we can start again and be able to keep getting bigger and stronger. And that's how you do it. And then, like what I said, there's no light sessions, there's no undulations in the weekly RPEs. There's no self-limiting variations that might control for that. It's just it doesn't really do a very good job of fatigue management. And plenty of people who I have talked to who have ran David's program always say that they always feel pretty beat up towards like the middle of it. So maybe something that David could have done is put a deload around in between each wave if he was going to do this super high intensity approach. But then for marketing purposes, it would be able to be like 9-week program, it'd be like a 3-week program with then a deload and wave load it. But yeah, it's not very sustainable. And I feel like a lot of people that run this usually feel pretty beat up towards the end. It's kind of like a Bulgarian type of a method in terms of how much intensity it pushes in volume, just constantly without any break. So the fourth principle is going to be SRA, which is stimulus recovery adaptation, which just defines the sequence of events. It's just how you get bigger and stronger. You present a stimulus in the workout that's going to be overloading. You're going to have to recover from that stimulus, and then over time you're going to have a return to baseline, and hopefully you'll be able to actually improve above that baseline, adapt, and become back bigger and stronger, so then next time you can actually add more weight to the barbell. And this is how progressive overload works. It's an adaptation. It's not something that you can force. How I can conceptualize this to people that might be a little bit confused by what I mean by that is that if you can do an RPE like if you say you did 280 on bench press 1 week for a set of 5, and then the next week you had to do, and then over time you did 285 at RPE 8 as for a set of 5. That's progressive overload. Your body adapted and it got better, it got stronger as a result of what you did in the past. It's realizing those adaptations that you put into place. So that is how SRA works. Now I don't think that this is, so in terms of SRA, it's like vice versa. It's like it's a one worse enemy. And what I mean by that is the training isn't very well organized. It's consistent, which is good. Like, we know that you're doing a legs push pull split. However, it's really hard for somebody who does to do a deadlift day and then a squat day the next day for most trainees. You're probably not going to be recovered in time for a secondary squat day or whatever, or for a secondary leg day to actually train again hard at RPE 8 to 9 or more. There's really big problems with the weekly structure and layouts. You're basically going to be feeling under recovered throughout the whole entire thing for most people. there's just not really any changes in how the stimulus is presented. I just don't think there's enough time for a maximum recovery to take place for most people, unless you're taking, you know, lots of unless you're like a ranked novice and you just have the adaptive proclivity. You're not super strong yet, so you can recover faster. Because smaller lifters, more novices, just don't have as much loads on their back. It's not as much of a disruption to their physiology. Like 600 pounds hits different than 300 pounds, just straight up. I don't think that I think this program does a very, very poor job of SRA in general. I don't, it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't do really anything good to really facilitate that. Besides having a legs push pull split, which is like, I'm really reaching on that one. The next principle is going to be variation, which is going to be the manipulation of training variables to prevent staleness and injury to magnify the long-term adaptive response to training. And variation can be created through changes in volume, intensity, rep ranges, tempos, ranges of motion, stuff like that. And so what he does well with this is non-linearity. So having that variation that's already baked into the DUP setup. You're changing the rep ranges, you're changing the loading in zones that you're using because of the rep ranges. And there's also several different accessories. You're training a lot of different movement patterns. This is going to prevent a lot of staleness, which is really, really good, and especially for hypertrophy purposes. You know, we like different exercises are going to hypertrophy different parts of the muscle to different extents. So he does a really, really good job with that. However, I don't think that's in terms of some of this exercise variation. This is similar to what I said about the push press and secondary push day, push two. He has overhead press and then incline press as the two primary push movements. What would make more sense is doing you know, a bench press and then a close grip bench press. So then specificity is better conserved. Like, you know, I think it's fine to have, like, you know, an incline press after a bench press, but probably want to have some sort of flat press on that day for the sake of specificity if we care about, you know, maximizing our adaptive response to training, because most people are going to need, especially on bench press, more frequent exposure. As well, there's kind of not enough variation for squat, bench, and for like the squat and the bench and the deadlift, because we have some decent data to show that if we are training different movement patterns, like having a squat and then a pause squat, it can also help our learning, our motor learning, our kinesthetic awareness, help us create a little bit more, you know, predictable adaptations. Greg Nuckols and Eric Trexler from Stronger by Science expand on this a little bit. I'll put it up in the cards probably, or in the description box below. That's something to consider. You know, he doesn't completely miss the box on this, but there are definitely areas that can be improved. The next principle is going to be phase potentiation, which is defined as the logical sequencing of training phases to promote long-term training outcomes. So basically, this would be splitting your phases of training onto different focuses. So maybe one phase you're focusing on volume to drive muscular hypertrophy, since volume with you know, with progressive tension overload over time is what will, you know, signal hypertrophy gains, as well as increasing work capacity. So then in the next phase of training, when you do enter in an intensity focused phase of training where your absolute intensities are higher, you have a little more competition and specificity on movements. You can take advantage of the higher work capacity and that muscle to, you know, help improve recovery and have a higher strength ceiling for that higher muscle once you start, you know, practicing with heavier loads. Also, it helps you, like, you know, get adapted to, you know, ramping up into higher intensities and whatnot. And again, David's program is just, it does not have any sort of phase structure to it. There's no conceivable linearity to it. It's kind of a permanent peaking program. You're constantly always going heavy. There's super high intensities. You're always hammering in the same movement patterns all the time. You know, maybe what would make a little bit more sense is, like, if he did define, like, you know, well, this is a volume phase, and, you know, maybe I really want to emphasize, you know, front delt strength and whatnot, then maybe having a overhead press would make sense. But he doesn't, you know, he doesn't frame it like that. It's just constantly, all I see is an intensity focused peaking program with, you know, volume with some higher rep work, thrown in there. It doesn't really make a ton of sense. What would make more sense is maybe in the first phases of training, he had top sets of like 4 and 5, and then his backed off sets were undulating between maybe like a 10s and 8s, or maybe 8s and 6, or like 8s and 6s, and then he has a little more generalized exercise selection with maybe some more machine pressing, maybe some more machine flies, leg extensions, stuff like that. As you get closer and closer to the testing dates of the end of the training block, you move into more intensity focus of training, where training gets more specific to powerlifting. You are having more frequent high intensity exposures. That's when you start incorporating heavy singles, doubles, and triples. Our undulation pattern is within the 1 to 5 range predominantly. Maybe it's going between 3s and 5s, and something like that. And the problem with trying to do everything all at once all the time is that you're going to have that adaptive resistance, that repeated bout effect comes in. It's not as effective. You can't take advantage of improving certain systems to a larger extent, and then taking advantage of what you have reaped from those bigger adaptations in later phases of training. It's just not very well structured for that. I would add in different phases of different emphasis in terms of exercise size selection, loading ranges. I have a video that actually goes over exactly how I program in these distinct phases of volume and intensity, which I'll also link down in the description box below for you guys to see. But yeah, it's just no phase potentiation. So the last principle is going to be individual differences. And so the principle of individual differences basically just describes that everybody's going to have some sort of different response to training, whether that be through genetic makeup, if you tend to get beat up by high intensity, or you need more volume, depends on how advanced you are, how your nutrition is. And then also just like between different people, like one program might work really well for some person at some point of their life. Like David's program might work really well for a kid who just goes to school, has a low stress lifestyle, doesn't work a job, can basically eat, sleep, train, just go to school, low stress, get plenty of sleep, and it works for him, very, very, very well. And then maybe, at that same time, or maybe something happens where like he gets a lot more stress, he's not sleeping enough, he gets a job, and maybe that program doesn't work as well. Basically, it takes into account that not everybody's going to have the exact same response between people, and different phases of your training career, you're going to need different things. And so because this is a template program, unfortunately, it doesn't really do a very good job of taking into account individual differences. It's basically just written for everybody, for averages. And so if you don't need more individualized help, you're in that, that late novice, early intermediate stage, or you just need something to run, it could work well for you. But it doesn't take into account individualization to the training response at all. Some people are going to need, they just can't do lots of high intensity exposure. They get really beat up by it. Some people need more volume. Some people need less volume. Different people have different exercise selections, considerations. Maybe some movements tax their joints hard because their joints capsule, like in their shoulder, their coiling process is just shaped differently, and maybe their hips are work a little bit differently, and they get beat up by high intensities. Just there's a ton of different things with it, and unfortunately, just template programs usually won't score as high on this. Everybody has different volume needs, different volume tolerances, all that type of stuff that just have to be considered and incorporated to any sort of training approach when you are creating something for an athlete. So yeah, I know this is kind of a long video, but that kind of concludes all of those, my whole critique of David Laid's program. My general synopsis of it is, how would I rate it? It's okay. You can certainly run it, try it, see how you respond to it. However, I think that there are better training programs out there that you can find for free, even like Stronger by Science's template programs, Progressive Resistance Systems, Steve DeNovi's template program. I have a template program for free that you can run. But the reality is that if you're a beginner, yeah, you can run this. I mean, you're going to benefit from structure in any way. See how you respond. Over time, as you get more advanced, you're probably not going to benefit or see a very good training response from this. You're going to just need more individual visualization in your approach, a little bit more specificity to the powerlifting movements in general. So yeah, that's my general synopsis of it. If you want to run it, you can. There's plenty of people have seen results on it, but my opinion is that it's aight. You can probably find something better. If you really want to have the best programming, possible, you should probably pay somebody who's qualified to write you a program. Invest a little bit more money than $30 in your training to have the best training results. So anyways, thank you guys so much for watching. Please like the video if you did enjoy it. Share it with a friend. Follow me on Instagram, Adam D. Peeler. Like the video, subscribe if you want. And I do coaching programs too, adampeelerfitness.com. Links down in the bio. And I'll catch you guys in the next one. Peace.